This is Matt from MGMT Boston. On this episode of Lantern, we have Melissa Withers, co-founder and managing partner of RevUp Capital. So we're here to talk about what she's building, what she's seeing in this ecosystem, and more importantly, a different approach to venture capital and company growth for 95% of companies. So Melissa, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I spend a lot of time traveling. I have almost 100 portfolio companies all over the United States, but I consider myself Boston-based and like a New England hometown honey. So really happy to talk to you today about all things Boston.
Which we love. Now, first question, what are you building? And most importantly, what are you up to this summer? What are you seeing in the market?
Yeah, so I've been working as a professional investor for about a decade, and in 2016, after running a relatively traditional early stage fund, I became frustrated by some of the constraints of the venture capital model. In particular, having exits being the only way to monetize an investment I found that was leaving a lot of value on the table for a really exciting asset class that is really big and important to American entrepreneurship, but really for many reasons, is not ideal for the 1%, right? That institutional venture chases, like unicorns, right? Unicorn adjacent. So while to many, my fund looks very traditional in the sense that we're not a bank, we're not writing loans. We look like a boutique equity fund in how we operate and the kinds of relationships that we have with our founders and our portfolio companies. We have the flexibility to use a model that in some cases will use revenue growth as a way to produce portfolio returns rather than just exits. So what it allows us to do is invest in a much broader spectrum of companies because we can be kind of exit agnostic. So as long as I see a company that has a $30 to $50 million potential, I can confidently invest even if I'm unsure what the ultimate exit value might be.
Definitely. And as you think about this summer, obviously there's so much going on in the world of early stage startups, Boston, other ecosystems. What are you seeing? Tell us what's going on in the world.
This summer's really strange. People are working longer and harder, all the mythologies around don't raise money. I feel like maybe we're all just distracting ourselves from the sort of geopolitical doom that's all around us. But I keep waiting for summer to start and waiting for my vacation to come. And here we are the second week of July, and there's events all week, which is sort of part of what makes Boston special and so interesting. I think this summer is a time for many of reflection. Many of the things that we've been watching, kind of like a slow motion car crash, really have come home now. And so I think it's a time to kind of gear up and get ready and reflect on what do we want the next cycle to look like. One nice thing about being old is I've lived through some cycles. I invested through a pandemic. I invested through, booms and busts. This feels like another cycle, right? Where there's a lot of change afoot. And so this summer, I think a lot of my colleagues and peers and founders and friends are working still awfully hard for July, but I think in many ways trying to gear up and prep ourselves to come back for the back half of 2025 to start to be more future looking again. Yeah, definitely. And as you think about what you've learned from RevUp, particularly all these portfolio companies that you've invested in, what works, what you even think about in terms of how to find and really understand how to build a great company, what are some of those attributes? Yeah, there's a few things afoot that are very different than when I started my first company many years ago. I think the first is that the half-life of everything is shrinking. The half-life of a business model, the half-life of a product model, the half-life of a value delivery model. It's epically shorter than even when I started building companies. Right. And I think on one hand, that unlocks tremendous opportunity to break free from the status quo, but it also challenges a lot of the things that we used to consider best practices. I think a lot of best practices are pretty out of date these days. Yeah. And you have to be, I think as a founder, I'm kind of glad to be on the other side of that. That's a really grueling, never-ending treadmill to be on that there's really not much you can anchor yourself to in the sense of creating longevity or long-term stability for your enterprise. I think it's, we're changing expectations around this idea that you're going to build a new legacy business versus being dynamic and nimble to take advantage of what might be shorter life cycles of value creation. And that's not how we teach entrepreneurship. And I think it's going to favor a different group of entrepreneurs than maybe the last 20 years did. Yeah, I think that's a really important insight. And last question, what are you seeing here in Boston that you would tell the rest of us to be on the lookout for? I think Boston's experiencing what many other places where I spend a lot of time is experiencing. I think geography is changing. The role of geography, the throughput of people. I will say Boston is establishing itself as being pro-immigration, very welcoming in ways that other parts of the country are not. That gives me hope and great optimism for the future here. Obviously, we can't control what the federal government does, but there's a billboard right now with welcome in all the different languages. So I think you're seeing a big shift, though, in what geography means. What does global talent mean at a time when the United United States is locked down its attitudes towards global talent. I think regional positioning is increasingly important. This year at New York Tech Week, there was this huge contingent of Boston people there, and not in a conciliatory way, not in a, we had to come to New York because Boston sucks, but in a really exciting way where Boston and New York had all these great synergies and connections, and companies had locations in both. Been doing this for a decade. Never seen so many Bostonians at New York Tech Week, and I thought that was really good. And I think similarly, one thing that Boston does have that it's always had, it sucks if you're trying to drive around the city, but we have this compressed footprint, right? Yeah. And you can really move across some very deep wells of talent and technology in a literally compressed footprint.
Yeah.
And I think it allows for lateral connectivity and horizontal movement that in other towns and cities where quite literally the lack of geo-proximity creates some additional boundaries to that. So I think it's something that Boston needs to figure out how to make the most of it this moment. And if we're agreeing that we do want to be less constrained by political trends, more open to global talent, more supportive of our immigrant founders and colleagues, well, what are we going to do with that? And then how do we leverage that truly into a unique competitive advantage in the years to come?
Definitely. This is Melissa from RevUp, Matt from MGMT Boston, this episode of Lantern. Thank you so much for joining us.